interestingly, I will also talk about biases. We're probably very biased over in Töölö. This wasn't coordinated. But before that, I'll just tell a little bit more about my research interest. HRM capabilities in multinational corporations is the research topic that I will talk about, and HRM has to do with human resource management. But so I'm basically interested in people, like Matti's. And more specifically, I'm interested in people and their interactions in multinational corporations. So how can multinational corporations work more effectively with and through people? Okay. What does people and their interactions then mean? Well, that means people management processes, HRM, human resource management as the research field is called, as well as other types of processes, social architecture, and knowledge sharing within the MNC. And why multinational corporations? Well, they are an important vehicle for economic development and globalization. But even more so, they are a fascinating context in which you can act with people and their interactions. The fundamental nature of multinational corporations is that of geographical dispersion. So they are distributed social entities that are dispersed across a number of different geographical, cultural, and linguistic boundaries. And this makes them a very challenging operating environment. Now, despite the obvious challenges that have to do with the negotiating and navigating of all those boundaries, it can actually also be a source of advantage. Because when the knowledge residing in different parts of the organization is integrated together, that can lead to novel combinations and competitive advantage. But moving from this general description of my research interest, I'll focus on recent research findings that I believe that have some theoretical contributions and also practical relevance that's interesting to all of us regardless of field. These findings were recently published in Journal of International Business Studies, which is the #1 journal in our field. And they come from a project that was jointly done with the finance help of Academy of Finland and Tekes by people here in Aalto, including myself and Dean and Professor Ingmar Björkman from our school, business school, and then researchers from Hanken School of Economics and Vaasa University. What we were interested in was evaluation of HR capabilities within subsidiaries. So in other words, we were interested in whether HR departments of subsidiary units in MNCs were seen as good or capable in what they're doing, and if so, why? And we focused on the evaluations of different types of stakeholders. So the MNC is a particular environment in that it's not only geographically dispersed, so people are working in very many different locations, but it also operates very often as a matrix organization. So the consequence is that you have many different stakeholders, internal stakeholders within the company. And organizational actors, different groups in the organization, have to serve many masters. Okay, we focused on the evaluations of two key stakeholders of subsidiary HR departments. The corporate HR director at headquarters, representing the functional stakeholder group. And then the general manager of the subsidiary unit, representing the line management stakeholder group from the geographical part of the matrix. Okay, and we compared their evaluations. What we found was that these two stakeholders were different, were evaluating the capabilities of the very same organizational actor, yet their evaluations were very different from each other. And they form them differently. And this is important because previous research has looked at evaluation biases from the perspective of organizational behavior. And looking at biases such as behavioral biases, rate accuracy, things that have to do with perceptions at the individual or group level, such as halo effects, personal efficacy, evaluator, etc. What we added was that we argued that macro-level structural influences may have an equally important or perhaps even more important influence on evaluations, at least in the multinational context. And let me go into those details in a little bit more detail. So we found that the evaluations of these two key stakeholders were systematically influenced by two structural factors. The first one had to do with the responses of the focal actors, the target of the evaluation. They tended to put more effort into responding to the expectations of co-located evaluators, stakeholders. So if you are a stakeholder or evaluator, a superior that is co-located with the organization actor, they put more effort into fulfilling your expectations, regardless of reporting line. Okay? And this has to do with the degree of face-to-face interaction, which leads to both psychological obligation as well as, from the principal agency perspective, more monitoring opportunities on behalf of the stakeholder. And then secondly, and perhaps more importantly, and this is the more novel finding that we had, they also construct their evaluations differently. So basically, neither of the stakeholders were evaluating any real or objective capabilities. They were rather basing their evaluations of cues that they picked up depending on what they saw and perceived as capability relevant, and then filled in the gaps to construct the evaluations. And as a result, the co-located, the on-site evaluators tended to base their evaluations on personal experiences. Okay? Whereas off-site evaluators, those who were not co-located, were, for example, at headquarters, they tended to base their evaluations from comparative or relative reputation, so based on who these evaluation targets were and on communicated information. Okay, so it's basically a case of personal experiences versus relative comparable or comparative relative reputation. Okay, now what can we take from these findings? Well, there are several takeouts really. And the first one, I've written them down so that I can remember them better. The first one has to do with, it has to be underlined that organizational capabilities are really important. They are the core of the success of many firms. So they are important. However, a word of caution is due, because no such thing as objective capabilities may exist. Okay. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, you see different things depending on where you're located, and you base your evaluations on different things. And therefore, being aware of where you are located is really important. And this, in particular, this has consequences for multinational corporations and headquarters, top management in multinational corporations. Because what you see from distance, from headquarters, for example, may not be the full picture. And yet, top management very often tends to base their attention and recognition of various organizational actors, groups, people, based on their own perceptions. This is the intuitive thing to do. Okay. And then finally, on-site evaluators, those who were co-located, tended to evaluate capabilities of the focal organizational actors higher. This does not necessarily mean that the evaluations were better or more accurate, because they are still subject to rate biases, for example, behavioral biases, and there's no comparative element. However, what this does point out is that decision makers have to be really aware of that where they are located crucially influences their evaluations. Okay. And all in all, our findings, we were focusing on the evaluations of subsidiary HR departments, but our findings apply to any context where geographical separation matters. Any organization really that works across different locations, different offices, different departments, different groups, such as Aalto University, in fact. And if decision makers, Tuula, are not aware that their location actually influences their evaluations, there can be some systematic biases in that. Okay, and in fact, there may even be consequences for the individual level. And this is something that I was interviewed recently for HR Zone, which is an online international HR magazine for HR professionals. And what we concluded there was that as an individual, in terms of, for example, remote working, which is a very topical issue at the moment from Yahoo and other news, you might be working your heart out, but if others don't see it, it doesn't exist. They might be indifferent, or it might even have negative consequences. And this, if we broaden this out, if we all evaluators of each other, really, and we tend to exaggerate our own contributions. And this is not necessarily intentional, but rather we see everything, all the thoughts that are in our minds and all the work put into something, be that a research paper or a project or anything else. But we don't see the thinking, the work, the effort, and the sweat and the stress of others, especially as if they are geographically remote. And in fact, as organizational actors, we do need to pay attention to this as well, because we might be doing brilliant work, but if no one knows about it, then it doesn't exist. And this, again, I mean, I'm thinking of our world here, academia. As academics and researchers, we need to publish in places that people read, in the top journals, because if we don't, no one knows about the brilliant work we do here. Thank you very, very much for your attention.